All right, hey, we're gonna give this a shot. It's been, oh man, it's been one of those days. Welcome to UJUG, everyone. stuff is not working because technology is amazing and whatnot. I am filling in for Jonathan, who was going to be emceeing tonight, but his fiber went down about 20-ish minutes ago. So I'm filling in for him. And Nate may or may not have issues getting stuff working. Maybe. Let's remove him and we'll add him again. Because it's just one of those days. And the keyboard, my typical keyboard, oh, Nate's not live anymore. My typical keyboard that I was using, I spilled water on it a couple of days ago, and that doesn't work yet. And my replacement keyboard has not come in yet. So, like I said, it's just been one of those amazing days. Last couple of days, I suppose. Anyway, I don't believe we have, yes. Yep, there's Jonathan. It is definitely one of those days. I don't believe we have any one of our sponsors here. If so, please speak up over there in chat. I'm looking through the names. I'm not seeing anyone that's really jumping out at me. And hopefully Nate comes back in a minute and we can get this ball going. But thank you for the sponsors that are not present tonight, but thank you for the sponsors that allow us to do this each month so that we can keep presenting and bringing you content that's relevant for your jobs, your hobbies, whatever it may be. Grateful to have you here. Let's see. I don't have my slides tonight, so I'm just I'm winging this one. Next month, we have Steve. Steve Afrin is here. He's going to be talking about things that have changed in Java, not just Java itself, like the language, but also a few things in the JVM as well, but things that have changed since Java 11. So if you're still running on Java 8 or so, that few things to catch up on, but mostly we're looking at from 11 to the current version of Java. So you can take a look at that. He's got some code samples and all the other fun stuff. There he is in chat. Code samples, GitHub repo that you can use and pull down and play with all the latest and greatest stuff that's in the Java language currently. Let's see, that's September. I don't remember what we've got going on in October. Let me find it real quick. Let's see, October. We can pull up the notes. And UJUG. October, we have... Oh, that's right. Garrett Grunwald is speaking just before Java 1 on October 11th. I don't remember exactly what, but he'll be presenting the same talk that he's doing at Java 1. So we'll get that a little bit earlier. So that should be good. In November, we're rounding out the year with Jeremy Davis from Red Hat. He's going to be talking, again, I don't have the title on here, but he's going to be talking about some of the tech and, oh, wait a minute. No, I saw his talk at DevNexus, and it was... That's right, Nate. Jeremy is talking about monoliths and microservices, or when you would want to use one versus the other. I believe that's the talk. Question: Will we be returning to in-person or Lucid? Honestly, that really kind of depends on the people that show up. We did not have a whole lot of people show up to the in-person meetings before. And to be frank, if we're not getting the people there, there's a lot of logistics that go into play for us as board members. And it's a lot of work that at this particular point in time, without the numbers there, we're just going to be continuing to staying on Crowdcast unless those numbers change. Yeah. All right. Let's see. Nate, you're still here. Let's bring you on live, and hopefully this works, and we'll go from there. Those that are present when I end up doing the drawings, There we go. Must be present to win for any of the door prize stuff. We've got a couple of licenses from JetBrains, Vencat's Agile Learner subscription for a full year that we're giving away. And what else? I think that's about it. So we've got Nate over here. It was not picking up the correct camera. So
Nope, still isn't.
We get about from like nose down to about chest level. You're looking at the wrong camera though. There. It's like
that's the laptop camera, which I never used for obvious reasons. Yeah, it's good times. Let me see if this will let me. No, wait, that wasn't the button I wanted. Okay, that turned my video off. I was hoping maybe that would. Well, let me see if this little setting things will do anything. No, see, it still only sees for some reason my FaceTime camera and my. Yeah, that's awesome. That's just fantastic. Well,
that's cool. Then there he goes, reconnecting.
Good times. I think either, I mean, it is like lightning and thunder and whatnot, although I did ping other members of my household and they claim they're not having any internet issues, but I think my wonderful corporate supplied VPN decided to just clock, and then now it's finally connected. So I assume that's why it wasn't happy before. I don't know. My apologies. How many engineers does it take to a screencasting technology? Apparently at least one more.
Right. All right. Well, I think we'll do that. Are you ready to present? You got that up?
I think so. Yeah. Let me actually see if I can share my screen. I'm going to try to pick the correct screen. And
that's always a fun one.
Oh yeah, it is like
hey, there we go.
Pouring over there.
Production Hardened services.
That's great. That's the right deck, right? Is that what we want to talk about? You want me to talk about anything else? I mean, I work for you, so you tell me what you want me to talk about, and I'll talk about it.
Yeah, no, this is good. This is what we're expecting.
All right.
All right. Well,
throw that up.
Shall I leave it to you then?
Awesome. All right, cool. Again, my apologies, friends, for the strange camera angle that you're seeing of me. You get a nice view of my microphone. If my cat was here, you'd actually get a very nice view of him. He likes to kind of lay like right in this general area. And that's part of why I have a split keyboard, because otherwise he would lay on the keyboard, and that's not great. He has created meetings. He has slacked people. He's done the same thing to my wife. It's worse when I'm not here, because he's very particular about how things are supposed to go. And so when I'm not here, he takes it all out on Christine. So yeah, at least I'm around. Okay. Well, hi, my name is Nate Schutta. My apologies for the technical issues here today. It's let's just call it a Monday. It's close enough. If you're interested in architecture, I did do a report on that a few years back. So this is all my thoughts on architecture, and this is all my thoughts on microservices, or at least some of them anyway. So pros companion to at least some of the things that we'll get into today. Now, the services things have been around here for a while. You know, everything seems to be as a service these days. And in fact, I like to call myself architect as a service. Someone called me that a few years ago, and I thought, hey, that's actually pretty darn close. I go places, I talk to people mostly about architecture. I will admit I did sound that acronym out in my head and realized it may not have been intended as a compliment. But there's infrastructure, container, function, software, pizza. At least I think pizza is a service. Again, I'm an architect as a service. You got a lot of those today, don't we? And if you've gone down this path, you're probably figuring out by now that microservices aren't in fact a panacea, that there actually are real challenges here. And how do we maintain this sort of healthy microservices biome? And well, should we just go back to the old days and just have a monolith that we release periodically? Maybe we should just change careers. I don't know. Tonight's making me rethink some career choices, that's for sure. It's always interesting to think about like how we got here. Now, none of this is new. I mean, to be very fair, SOA was the new thing not that long ago, and everything had to be all SOA all the time. And there were talks and blogs and books and all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, there was API first, and that was really popularized in certain quarters. I know one of the first ones I ran into is actually this one, which seemed rather strange. Why would Charmin, of all people, create this API? Well, it was where to find a restroom when you're out and about. And that turns out to actually be pretty darn useful if you're in a city that you don't live in, or even if you do and you need to find a restroom in a hurry. That sounds actually pretty darn helpful. Now, there's a pretty darn good chance you've used some variant of the dark sky APIs. I mean, although I can tell you just by looking out the window, yeah, it's raining pretty hard here. pretty good chance you've used that one on a regular basis. Now, even maybe you don't care about the weather, but pretty much guarantee you've used something out of the Google ecosystem, at least indirectly. Now, it's always interesting to take a step back and ask yourself, like, what has caused this sort of Cambrian explosion of APIs? And a lot of it's just the reality of the technology change and the fact that, we're all carrying these little supercomputers around in our pockets. So now you're carrying a really powerful computer with you basically everywhere. And you are talking to this commoditized hardware known as the cloud, and we're expecting it to do interesting things for us. It's amazing how many products our phones have replaced in our lives. Back in the day, I remember when my wife and I went on like our honeymoon, some of the first trips we took, where you're taking a camera and you got to get maps and you got to have all these devices with you and you got to bring something to play music and maybe some speakers to listen to music. And now all of these things are in our phone. And my son is 15, so he's the same age as the iPhone. And so he's never known a world without that. So to him, a phone is a slab of glass. And it occurs to me that he's never really known boredom, not the way many of us did when we were kids. You'd go on a long road trip or it'd be the middle of summer and it's like, well, there's just reruns on TV and geez, what am I supposed to do? I'm bored. We now have the entire internet at our disposal and it's amazing some of the things that are out there. So basically what we're doing here is turning all our volumes up to 11 for better or worse. Now, companies have clearly changed their approach, and some of this came from a little place you may have heard of called Amazon. Now, obviously, this has been happening for a while, and an interesting rant actually gave us some insights that we would not have had otherwise. So this was several years ago, but Steve Yegi, who had worked at Amazon for a number of years, then went to Google, wrote this piece that he really only meant for internal consumption, but even Steve Yegi couldn't get the settings right on Google Plus back in the day. And so he made it basically public. And it was great because we all got this insight that we wouldn't have had otherwise. And so what Bezos had mandated at Amazon was, all data is going to be exposed through an API, all of it, period, full stop, no exceptions. These interfaces are the communication method between teams, period, full stop, no exceptions. And there's no other forms of communication, no direct reads, no links, no backdoors. This is the way it has to be done, period. And oh, by the way, all of these need to be public. That doesn't mean they're all going to be public, but that's the goal anyway. And by the way, if you're not interested in doing this, no problem, you're fired. As you can guess, things began to change. People reacted to that incentive and began to create these new types of APIs. And we picked up a few things along the way. Well, it turns out when a call bounces between 20 different services, it's a lot harder to figure out where the problem was. And there's a lot of finger pointing. Who do we wake up in the middle of the night? We have to have good monitoring in place. Observability is just table stakes in this environment. Well, then, of course, we have the reality that services are coming and going. And, how do I even know what's here? And of course, debugging this is a real pain because, in the old days, I could just put a breakpoint in and I'd poke the application and hop in and just step my way through. Okay, here's the problem. It's just gotten harder. The reality in most organizations today, I can't swing a dry erase marker without somebody talking about microservices and bounded context. And we finally now figured out what Eric was talking about 20 plus years ago. And, we can have all sorts of debates about what we even mean by a microservice. This is one of my all-time favorite tweets. This is my old boss, Andrew Clay Schaefer, who wants to argue about the definition of made up words with me. It's absolutely right. I'm partial to anything that reminds me these things are supposed to be small. So I like saying anything you can rewrite in 2 weeks or less. I've had some people say, oh, it's anything that's done by a 2-pizza team. I'm not a big fan of that for a bunch of reasons. Then I've had some people tell me, we're doing mini services or pico services or macro services. I don't like arguing about the definition of all these things. But clearly the concept of an application has changed. It used to be more of a coherent sort of singular thing. Now it's a much more nebulous term, to be quite honest with you. It's usually made up of a series of things. Well, what about functions? I've heard that's kind of the new thing, right? We'll do everything as a function and functions as a service. And, you can't use Java for that, except of course you can. And, maybe I made a bad architectural choice and that's why I shouldn't be using functions. We keep searching for a golden hammer, or maybe I guess in our universe, we're really looking for Mjolnir, although I'm still trying to figure out how, as far as I know, it was destroyed in the current timeline, but then I'm pretty sure, at least from the trailer I saw, that it looks like Natalie Portman swinging this thing around. So I haven't seen the movie yet, so I'm not sure what storyline brings Mjolnir back, but I'm sure it makes sense. Now, I wish I had this, frankly, the next time I had a retro or just had a debate with an engineer. But the reality is there are some really tough engineering things that we have to deal with in these environments. I wish I could tell you it was all puppies and rainbows. It's not. Sorry about that. The things that Yegi talked about before are still things we need to deal with in these environments. Turns out one of the hardest things we have to deal with in these microservice biomes is culture. Now, I know that's a little strange. Like, why am I talking about culture? I'm a technologist, and trust me, I've learned the hard way that you got to get the culture part right. Culture is really hard. Culture is where good ideas go to die. It's also one of those things that's super duper hard to change in organizations. It gets started really early on. You hire, attract, retain based on your culture. Think about what Bezos did. He basically said, if you don't make this change, you're fired. I'm going to go out on a limb and say you don't have that ability in your organization. Now maybe you're the founder and you can go ahead and your word is law, but for most of us, we don't have the ability to just say this is how it's going to be. Now, microservices absolutely offers us a bunch of advantages. There's scalability. You've got better developer productivity. You can use the right technology or language or database for your problem domain, but there are no silver bullets here. And it's always important. One of the things that I've learned the hard way as both an engineer and an architect is anytime someone comes to you and says, oh, this is the answer, you should be skeptical. And you should be immediately asking, hey, what are the trade-offs here? Everything in software is a trade-off. Everything in software is an it depends scenario. This is one of those things that I learned right out of college. In school, there's an answer that's going to get you an A, and there's an answer that's going to get you a B, and there's an answer that's going to get you a C. And the way we teach computer science, we sort of kind of pretend that that's how it all works. And then you get into the real world and you're like, well, what's the design that gets me an A? Well, there isn't one. There is no best in software. There's a lot of least worst. That's really what we're striving for. Now, of course, one of the other things that we're running into is the reality that our org structure is problematic here in many cases. So I'm sure you've heard of Conway's Law. This is actually something that was thrown out there in the late 60s, well before we talked about microservices or functions or cloud or any of these things. And Conway didn't even have a way of proving it at the time. He's like, yeah, this seems right. And he's correct. What it boils down to is that any organization that designs a system is basically going to mimic its org chart. And so if I'm trying to create a bunch of small isolated services, well, how do I do that if my organization isn't a set of small isolated teams? This is where the concept of the inverse Conway's law or the inverse Conway maneuver comes in, which says, well, evolve your org structure towards the end state that you're driving at. Now, this also leads to some really interesting outcomes because, geez, my teams are really siloed, but I need the microservices to work together. I mean, one microservice by definition cannot solve everything I'm trying to do here. So how do I get everybody to work effectively together, especially if our incentives don't align? How do I fix that? How do I build out infrastructure that can support a bunch of different teams, potentially using different technologies, different languages, different frameworks? How do I staff up the operations team? How big should my operations team be? Now, some organizations have a fairly large ops group, and, we really don't want it to be a one-to-one relationship. Although, to be fair, when you bring that kind of a discussion to the head of ops, they're going to have a different opinion. They want a bigger fiefdom. This is, interestingly enough, one of the resistors that we run into with some of these technologies is it allows you to run platforms with small teams. Well, if you're the group that are running these platforms and you realize, wait, we bring this thing in and, a third, a half of my team is gone. Well, maybe I'm not so keen on bringing this in, am I? This also does mean that we as developers have to take more responsibility. We have to really embody that you build it, you own it mindset. Are we okay with pager duty? Because that's going to happen. I can't just say, hey, that's an ops problem now. We also have to deal with technical sprawl. If you thought suburban sprawl was a problem, technical sprawl is a lot worse in many cases. Now, it does allow us to be polyglot, which at least on the surface is fantastic because, oh, wow, everybody can use the right tool for the job. They can use the right language and the right data store. And isn't that amazing? Except now we run into resume-driven design territory. And now I decide, well, yeah, I definitely want to use Go on this because, well, I mean, truthfully, I just want to put Go on my resume. So that's why I want to use Go. Well, it might be the right choice, might be a really bad choice. We really need to think through a little more than just what looks good on my CV. Now, of course, if we're not careful here, we don't have one or two ways of doing something. We have like infinity ways of doing something. And everybody's got their own favorite tools, their own favorite languages, their own pipelines, their own metrics. And now I've got a lot of ways of doing stuff. Now that, of course, leads to a conundrum of, well, how do I staff that up? Where is this unicorn developer that knows all these different languages? Never mind everything else that's in play here, the different data stores, the containers, the container orchestrator, the cloud platform. I mean, this grows exponentially. Oh, and by the way, how many libraries do I need to support all of that? And can I actually stay current on all of that? You know, we've seen all these interesting bugs over the last several years, and we'd like to believe that we're getting better at it, but I don't know. Doesn't seem like we are. So it can't be a free-for-all. It can't be do whatever you want, 1,000 flowers bloom. There need to be some guardrails in place. Now, those could be very broad. At some organizations, it's, hey, use whatever you want as long as it runs on the JVM. We know how to support the JVM. My previous organization, we basically had 3 primary languages. You could use Java, you could use JavaScript, you could use C#. If you wanted to use something else, part of my job was to tell you you were wrong. Now, if you had a really compelling reason why you needed to use something else, well, let's have a conversation. So when our data scientists were like, but R, but Python, yeah, of course, no problem. But that doesn't mean Python is now a standard development language for us. Sorry. We really do need to be focused on paved roads. And frankly, that's what's going on even at these organizations with the most ingrained developer autonomy. They have this process where, you know what, we have put code through to production on this platform thousands and thousands and thousands of times. We know it works. We know how to support it. Now, if you want to go down that minimum maintenance road, I mean, knock yourself out, but you did bring your snow chains, right? Because this could be a problem down there. There's a reason why we call it a minimum maintenance road. Again, you build it, you own it. One of the interesting outcomes here is this sprawl has a tendency to exacerbate our accumulation of technical debt. So we need to be a lot more vigilant about making sure that we're not getting things out of control here. We also have to realize that these distributed architectures fail in lots of unique and interesting ways. These microservice ecosystems are far more complicated. We've added some accidental complexity to the process. Now, we get some things in return for that, but we do need to understand that that does not come for free. So you've got all these small pieces that are changing potentially all the time. What would you say your system does? How do you reason about a system when you're not even necessarily sure what's deployed right now and who's calling what and who responds to what event, who has registered interest in an event and then decide, I don't care about that anymore? It should be pretty obvious that this is more difficult than it was before. This also does open us up to some new, interesting, unique ways of failing. This is part of why, again, chaos engineering is such an important part of what we're doing. You have to force your system to fail in interesting ways. And even with all that in place, you know what? Things are going to go wrong. I have thought a lot about these heavyweight SDLCs that I've had to endure in my career. And when I'm being charitable, I understand that each step in that process was probably there for a good reason. You know, project had this problem and you know what, we don't want other projects to have this problem. So we're going to add this step to the process. But I've never seen anyone audit that process to say, hey, does this step actually prevent this bad thing? And, you know, if it does, I guess that's okay. If it doesn't, well, we should fix the step, right? Maybe remove it or tweak it or something. But the other thing that really frustrates me is I've seen very few organizations actually take the time and effort to think through, well, what do we do if the bad thing still happens? You know, the SRE mantra here would be, you know, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. You know, one of the conversations I've had with my son ad nauseum is 2 is 1, 1 is none. You know, so one of the he's a goalkeeper in soccer, and he's got, you know, this week was tryouts in high school, and he's got a scrimmage coming up on Saturday, and so one of the things I've told him multiple times is better bring 2 pairs of gloves with you to every practice because you never know when one's going to break. Because I very distinctly remember the tournament that we were walking back towards the car. He was taking off his gloves, and the gloves ripped right at the seam, and hope we have a backup pair somewhere. So now I've gotten in the habit basically of anytime he needs a new pair of gloves, I usually order a couple of them because it's always good to have a spare somewhere. We can't prevent every bad thing from happening. Bad things are still going to happen, but we can prepare for it. Resources do not scale to infinity. I'm sorry. I mean, they kind of do, but it's going to cost you a lot. Although a friend of mine told me an interesting story. He said his data scientists were doing some interesting stuff. You know, they were very excited about all this cloud stuff, and they ran some experiment overnight. And the next day they get a ping from their cloud provider saying, hey, are you guys planning on doing this again in the future? And I said, well, I don't know. I guess we haven't given it much thought. You know, why do you ask? Well, you guys soaked up all of our compute last night when you ran this. So if you're going to do that again, we just need to install some new racks and blades and whatnot. So we would appreciate a heads up the next time you go down that path. By the way, there's always competition for hardware, staff, priorities, head count. I have yet to meet a manager who's like, yeah, no, I'm good. My team's as big as it needs to be. Everyone I know says, of course, I could use another engineer or 10. Every VP I've ever met says, oh, my portfolio is the most important portfolio in the entire company. We should get all of the budget. Again, no one could have predicted this. Now, one of the things that you realize when you start getting into this service environment is all services are equal, but some services are more equal than others. And so we do need to think long and hard about how we define our SLOs. It's a really important step here. And a lot of times we talk about this in terms of availability. And so we do need to ask, what is the availability goal for this particular service? And that's going to differ from service to service, even within the same application. Strongly advise that you familiarize yourself with the SRE book. You can get this online. You can get this on the O'Reilly platform. A lot of good stuff hiding in there. By the way, you don't need to read this book cover to cover. It's just a series of essays sort of thematically grouped together. One of the interesting bits in here is the difference between an SLA and an SLO. And the terminology here is misused often. This all starts with an SLI, a service level indicator. So this is a measure of some aspect of our system, you know, latency, error rate, throughput, whatever, and availability. We talk a lot about availability for better or worse. Now, this is typically referred to in terms of how much time is your service available. Another way of thinking about it is how much downtime can you tolerate. Now, this gets discussed in terms of nines, but most of us aren't really sure what we mean by nines. We just throw them around and more nines is better, right? Give me more nines. I got to have more nines. Well, 2 nines means you're down. You can be down a little over 7 hours a month or 14 minutes a day. This is actually pretty achievable for pretty much all of us. You know, this isn't much of a stretch with modern technology. 3 nines is a little harder. Now we're talking about a little under 9 hours a year, a couple minutes a day. 4 nines, we're jumping up to 4.38 minutes a month, or less than 9 seconds a day. So if your application's down longer than it takes Usain, well, as long as it takes Usain Bolt to run the 100-meter dash, sorry, you just blew 4 nines. You don't qualify for that anymore. 5 nines, we're talking about 6 seconds a week or 864 milliseconds a day. I mean, my gosh, that's asking for a lot there. Now, I do think GKE bumped this up a little bit recently, but their SLA for GKE for a long time was 99.5. So if some of the best in the world at working at scale are not giving you 5 nines, that should give you a sense of what we should be targeting in a lot of instances. Now, from there, we can create a service level objective. This is our target value, could be a range of values. So we could say our SLO for availability is 3 nines. We'd like our average response time to be less than 100 milliseconds. This is not always easy. We'll talk more about this here in a minute. And we don't always have a choice here. Turns out our customers have some strong opinions, and we're obviously dependent on anything we depend on. So if you are dependent on something that's 3 nines, you can't exceed that. That becomes your ceiling. So you, by definition, have to be below that. So I can't say I'm 4 nines if I rely on something that's 3 nines, although I've had a lot of people try to do that. It's funny. From there, we might create a service level agreement. Now, the difference between an objective and an agreement here is the consequence. If there's no consequence, we have an SLO. As soon as we have a consequence, now we have an SLA. This is not a technical thing, by the way. This is contract law. So this always usually involves some kind of financial penalty. Maybe you owe me money or I owe you free service. If there's no consequence, it's an SLO. Again, this is a product decision. This is a legal decision. This is not a technical decision. Many of us use these terms interchangeably. They're not. I do realize that's very pedantic, but ubiquitous language. Now, everybody wants all of the nines. Everybody wants hot, hot, until they're told how much it's going to cost. This is an example of the if you have to ask, you can't afford it stream of thinking. Now, one of my team's superpowers is we will find the best coffee in a given city. And it's something we take a lot of pride in, quite frankly. I have a soft spot in my heart for artisanal coffee. And so a few years back, we had the good fortune of being in Johannesburg. And so the best coffee in Joburg happens to be at this very high-end car dealership. Now, I'm not talking like Lexus, Mercedes. I'm talking Lamborghini, Ferrari, restored Corvette, tricked out Range Rover. Now, the interesting thing about this car dealership, aside from the fact that it had amazing coffee inside of it, was the fact that there was no price tagged in any of these cars. Because if you're in the market for a Ferrari, you do not care how much it costs. That's kind of the point. You walk into that store and you're like, oh God, red is my favorite color. I'll take the red one. And well, my wife likes purple, so let's get the purple one too. That is the very definition of if you have to ask, you can't afford it. So when we talk about these services being production ready, we have to understand that we're putting a lot of faith in it. We hope that it behaves. We hope that it performs. We hope that it gets the job done. But how do I know if I can trust it? One of the most important, powerful things we can have is a checklist. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking, geez, Nate, really a checklist? I mean, I thought you were a technologist. If you don't think checklists are interesting, I beg you to read this book. Fantastic book. It kind of blew me away when I read it a few years back. It's important to understand that lots of industries use checklists. So I spend a lot of time on airplanes. Air travel is incredibly safe. And at least part of the reason for that is our pilots, our ground crew is going through a whole series of items before and after every single flight. They have process in place. Those processes are there for good reasons, often hard-earned reasons. I was on a flight in July that was delayed because the tertiary generator didn't turn on, and so they can fly without it, but they got to pull back in and get some paperwork signed off. And then once they did that, they're like, oh, okay, actually the mechanics have to unplug it, so they have to take some stuff off and put some stuff back on, and that requires more paperwork. I'm good with whatever time it takes. Like, do a good job. Let's not leave something rattling around in there. Yeah. And then the other place you see this a lot is surgery. Now, I had my hip replaced a few years back, and there was two really interesting things that came out of that for me. One, every single person I interacted with asked me what my birthday was. Now, I assumed that meant that I was going to get a whole bunch of gifts for my birthday, or at least a card. Yeah, none of that happened. That's the new unique identifier. I guess that's better than asking what your social security number is. The other interesting thing was, day of my operation, every single person I interacted with was asking, what are we doing today? Now, I always thought it was apocryphal when they said, your surgeon signs the joint. It's not. The day before in my pre-op appointment, my surgeon did literally sign my right hip. And the next morning, the pre-op nurse is looking for that signature. If they can't find it, they page your surgeon. The surgeon has to come back down, sign it again. Every single person I talked to that morning, what are we doing? And for good reason. It would sure be a bummer to be in recovery and have your doctor show up and say, hey, good news, bad news. Turns out we did the wrong hip, but surgeon went great. Don't worry, we'll do the second one, same price as the first one. So these checklists are pretty useful things, friends. Anything you put on that checklist, though, has got to be quantifiable. It's got to be measurable. It's not enough just to say the system should be fast. What do we mean by fast? Define fast. What you think is fast, I might think is slow, vice versa. So let's actually put some numbers around it. We want stability, reliability, scalability, fault tolerance, performance, monitoring, documentation. And I understand that for some developers, when I talk about this, they break out in hives and they're like, you got to be kidding me. I don't have time for any of this. You don't understand. I need to move fast and break things. We're capital A agile. I'm like, well, that's cool. But what happens to your velocity when, there's an outage and your business is ground to a halt? I've worked on some systems where outages were measured in 7 digits per hour. And whenever any of those apps had a hiccup, people I didn't even know were VPs appeared out of the woodwork and hovered. And I don't know about you, but I don't do my best work when people are hovering. Is it fixed yet? Is it fixed yet? How about now? When's it going to be fixed? How long is this going to take? We're on it. Just, chill. Now, this is hard. It does require buy-in from both our level as well as the managerial level. So what do we mean by stable and reliable? Well, our services are evolving all the time. That's kind of the whole point here. these distributed architectures allow us to move quickly. They allow us to embrace this always be releasing mindset, but it is a little bit like spinning plates, and all it takes is one wobble and like the whole thing comes crashing down. So how do I make sure that my services are stable and reliable? Well, I need consistency in my development process. I need to make sure that code passes any new and existing tests before I push it into our branch. Maybe I want to use pair programming or code reviews to make sure I've got a second set of eyes on any change. Got to have an automated build system. You know, this can't be a Rube Goldberg machine anymore. I've worked on those systems in the past. You know, right click in your IDE, drag that artifact to a magic drive location. That way lies madness. Now, from there, we do need a good build pipeline. Maybe we take advantage of feature toggles. You know, one of the things that has definitely changed during my career, the concept of deploy and release were one and the same for a long time. They don't have to be. They can be separate things. We can deploy code to production on a regular basis. That doesn't mean it's been released to our customers. So feature toggles are a really powerful feature for us to leverage. Just don't reuse a toggle, please. We need good, thorough testing, and that, of course, runs the gamut from linting to regression test to integration test to everything in between, and all this has to flow through this standardized pipeline. We need a standardized process. Now, there are almost infinite ways of going to production, and I can certainly dive into this if anybody's interested. There's a lot of different approaches. The whole goal, of course, is to find issues before it actually hits our customers. Now, it's interesting that we used to do sort of this 5x12 model where your application was available like Monday through Friday from 6 to 6 or something like that. And that worked for some definition. It worked. It doesn't really apply anymore. I mean, I have on more than one occasion, you know, been in bed and think, oh, that's right, I got to get this thing. And I hop on the internet and, you know, poke, order it, you know, put my iPad back on the nightstand. I don't want to wait. You know, if you can't be down at 10 at night like we used to be in the past. And most companies have gotten that, although it does not seem to be universal. My good friend Layla tweeted this out last summer. She went to this website and which temporarily closed. And she's like, you're kidding me, right? Like this is a joke, right? Of course, my response to Layla was certain deployment strategies are not evenly distributed in the wild. Customers' expectations have changed. This is no longer going to cut it. Now, the staging environment is this copy of production where we get an opportunity to try real-world stuff without real-world traffic. In some organizations, that is a percentage of production, although there are some companies that have decided, no, I want those two to be identical because they find interesting, weird things if they're not. We do need to treat staging as the real deal. If it gets there, it should have passed all of our internal checks, all the tests. Everybody has signed off on this. If we're comfortable there, we can go to a canary release where we're doing real traffic. This is the canary and the coal mine concept. So here are the ideas. Let's find an issue before we do that full production push. And that's going to be some percentage of our user base, 5%, 10%. And that, of course, can slide up over time. But they are serving real production traffic. You know, this isn't pseudo traffic. This isn't synthetic traffic. This is the real deal. If we find an error, well, let's roll back. Now, that does, of course, lead to the million-dollar question. Well, how long should we live in the canary stage? And the only answer I can give you is, I don't know. You tell me. Now, I've learned throughout my career that there's 3 answers to every question in computer science. There's 42. That's the geek check to see who's well-read. My favorite pattern as an architect, another layer of indirection. But then there's the answer I have to give so often it's almost a cliche, and that's it depends. Now, I teach at the University of Minnesota. I teach graduate students, and in the fall, I teach an architecture class. And so last year's cohort, I told them day one, I said, hey, the answer to everything this semester is going to be it depends. And I was really, really impressed with how quickly they grokked that concept. They were echoing that back to me almost immediately. Now, a friend of mine actually finds this so fascinating that he had a T-shirt printed up that says it depends on it, and he often presents in that T-shirt. Imagine that. Now, to give you a sense of what's possible here, I don't know how many of you remember when GitHub replaced merge. You know, you probably remember when GitHub went down for a couple of weeks so they could update merge. And of course, GitHub didn't go down. They replaced merge while we were merging code. Now, we can have an interesting debate about what are the top 5 or 10 features of a source code management tool, but merge is in there somewhere. And they changed merge again while we were merging code. This is an example of, well, let's fix the engine on the airplane while the airplane is in the air. What could possibly go wrong? Now, to be clear, a lot of engineering effort and discipline went into this. It wasn't just a YOLO, let's see what happens, it's probably going to be fine. They put a lot of time into it, and they took the time to write about it. And so this is something we can all learn from. And I bring this up mostly to say, think about how much time you've agonized over a relatively simple change. It doesn't have to be that way. We can do this differently. Now, hopefully by now we have almost no issues in production. We have found them earlier in the process. It's also important that the only path to production is your deployment pipeline. Now, I know how tempting it is to say, hey, just log into that server and push this, or just, go in and make this change. That way lies madness. Been there, done that, got the t-shirt. It's not one you want. All that does is bring new bugs into the situation. Pretty much a guarantee that was not properly tested. You also can't reproduce production now. That is bad. Do not do that. Roll back to the last stable build. Try again. Take the time it takes so it takes less time. That's another one I drill into my son. You also have to understand your dependencies, and I know how hard that can be. We also need to expect that they will fail. And I know how hard that can be. We're a very optimistic crew in software. Not entirely sure why sometimes, because software does fail a lot, but I guess we're just optimists by nature. The dependency graphs here can get a little nuts. There's a reason these kind of diagrams keep popping up. I think this is why Death Stars keep blowing up in about every other movie. They just have too many of these dependencies. So how do we deal with a dependency failing? Well, we got a lot of options. Maybe we have a cached result that we turn back. Maybe we have an alternative service, or, we use, just always return 42 or something. It depends entirely on the criticality. You think about your favorite online retailer, adding something to the cart, got to work every time. Okay, check me out, take my money, give me my product. That has to work every single time. It doesn't necessarily have to be dispatched immediately to the warehouse to send someone out to go pick it. It doesn't necessarily have to be boxed and shipped out in 5 minutes. Although I'll be honest with you, I'm kind of amazed how fast retailers can get things to you today. I ordered some flour and some pasta from a local miller that's just up the road from me. And I got the shipping notice, I don't know, 2 hours after I put in the order. It's going to be here tomorrow. I don't need it tomorrow, but kudos to them. And they're just a small business, so it's fascinating to me how some of these things work. Now, I spent a lot of my life in insurance, and I can tell you this much: insureds are going to submit a claim in the middle of a natural disaster. So you have to be able to accept the claim, period. This system can never go down. 365, 24/7, it has to accept a claim. That does not mean, of course, we're going to dispatch a claims handler that moment. Maybe it lives on a queue for a while, and then once we're back to normal operating hours, we go ahead and process it. We need to make sure there's a health check in place. Now, I live in the Java ecosystem, so I'm a big fan of Spring, and things like Spring Actuator gives you an awful lot of really powerful things right there. We need to be embracing this always be health checking mindset. Now, if things aren't healthy, well, don't keep pounding your head into the wall. Let's not route traffic to it. It's important that we have things like circuit breakers in place. Now, there's a bunch of different implementation options here. I'm obviously fond of anything as an architect that lets me get over the top of it here. But we have this concept of saying, if everything's going according to plan, the circuit is closed and the call flows through. And if there's a problem, we open the circuit and we fall back on whatever you've configured as the fallback mechanism. Again, that could be a default answer. That could be some cached answers. That could be a third-party service, a backup service, whatever makes sense to you. But you have to have things like that in place. Your services will not live forever. Sorry about that. You need to have a plan for deprecation. This, interestingly enough, is a cultural issue more than a technical issue. And so what we need to think about here is giving people advance warning. This is going to change. This is when it's going to change. And then monitor that old service to see, are people still calling it? All right, we need to follow up with them, because inevitably people are going to keep calling it even after you've given them ample time. The worst thing you can do is just say, it's fine. Everybody knock yourself out, abandon said service. That way lies madness. Now, we talk a lot about scalability. We do need to understand growth scales here. Now, I know some of us think, oh, the cloud, it all just goes to infinity. I don't need to think about this anymore. But we do need to have some rough ideas here of what we're looking at in terms of requests per second. Now, we can hopefully look at current load levels, and we certainly can and should do some load testing. Now, this might be a really good fitness function, but we need to understand the web of services that go into this. One service, our service potentially, is just one part of this larger universe. And so we need to understand what that growth scale looks like. How does that link to our business and changes in our business? So do we scale up by number of users, by number of orders? Is it related to certain times of the year? Do we have certain initiatives that are going to drive a lot of traffic? Now, of course, that's not just tied to one service. These are more complicated than that. So we are going to have some conversations with the business folk to say, hey, help me understand what drives the business. And then we have to figure out how that's going to translate to these services. Now, it really helps to have an accurate notion of what this looks like. Said this before, I'll say it again. All services are equal, but some services are more equal than others. We need to understand that certain services are business critical and they're going to have priority over others. Now, one of the things that's changed in my career is the fact that we used to put things on shared hardware. We had app servers that allowed us to put multiple apps on one physical box. And we thought, isn't that great? Because, hey, now we're sharing the hardware. We're getting more return on that investment, that very expensive piece of hardware. Except now your application bug takes my application down, and I don't like that too much. So we understand now that this resource isolation is actually a huge win. Although I have had some debates with infrastructure people in particular about, that's wasteful to have that library duplicated. Like, okay, here's $1. I think that'll cover it. You are going to have to do some amount of capacity planning as part of this to make sure we've got the right budget in place. Although maybe we want to think about changing our budgeting process. That's one of those fascinating aspects of software. We also need to understand our dependencies and their ability to scale along with us. If not, we may need to choose different pieces to collaborate with. And that's part of this. Again, this is more of a cultural issue than it is a technical issue. So we probably are going to have a review with those services that we rely on just to make sure that they can scale along with us. So what does your data growth look like? This is another one of those things we try to ignore because, data is free now. Well, yeah, not really. So we might also have some discussions about what data store makes sense. We have a lot of options now. On my Twitch stream, I've had a couple conversations with Jim Weber about this. And I find it really fascinating that for a good chunk of my career, for a good chunk of software, you had two types of databases. You had hierarchical and you had relational. And that's it. It's just like the Blues Brothers. We have both kinds of music here. And now you've got at least a half a dozen different styles of databases, data stores. So what makes sense for you? And how do you feel about eventual consistency? I will admit the first time I encountered this concept, I was a little hesitant. Like, no, man. I've heard everything has to be ACID compliant or we have a problem here. And I've gotten a lot more comfortable with eventual consistency because that's kind of how the world works. So are you read heavy? Are you write heavy? How do you want or need to scale that database out? Just because I can scale things in a simpler way than we had in the past doesn't mean I have to or get to ignore all of this. Let me pause there and just see. I know when we had discussed this, we talked about doing some presentation, some lecture, or some interview. Do you want me to pause here or you tell me? I work for you. And, I'm going to try one other thing here with my extra camera and see if I can get this thing to fix now.
I'm good if you want to keep going, Nate. It's an interesting topic. And as far as questions go, do you want me to pause when questions show up or do we want to hold them to the end? What do you want to do?
Well, if you've got a question right now, I'm happy to do that. And let me see if I can find the settings again. And now maybe it'll recognize that I have another camera or not. Why won't you let me see the cameras? You did that before. Shoot. All right. Yeah. Are there any Nate's beard? Yeah, that's about right. That's about right. Oh, there we go. That's the one I was looking for. So let me find.
No, there are no questions at the moment.
And look at that. I finally got my camera to connect. Okay, good. Now.
Hey, look.
There
we go.
My lower extremities there. Oh, good times. All right, let's keep rolling. Fault tolerance. I mentioned this before. I'll say it again. I can't prevent all bad things from happening, but I can build failure resistance into my services. Again, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. I'm absolutely convinced this is the world's first site reliability engineer. We just hadn't invented the title at that point. This is Margaret Hamilton. She worked on the original Apollo software. It dawns on me that we're all carrying around more compute in our pockets than like NASA had in order to put people on the moon and bring them home. It's pretty crazy. Now, she was doing a test in the lab one day. She was simulating a lunar landing and inadvertently pressed a pre-launch button, and that wiped out all the navigation data. Now, unlike your phone, which simply says, oh, hey, you missed your turn. Don't worry, I got you. I'll recalculate another route for you. Yeah, this is a problem. And so Margaret did what any good engineer would do. She went to her bosses and said, hey, we got to bake some error handling code in here. This will be an issue if this happens in the real world. And they're all like, that's crazy, Margaret. That'll never happen. And you know what? These astronauts are perfect. They're highly trained. We'll just tell them, don't press the button, and they won't press the button. Well, you can guess what happened. It turns out they did right around Christmas 1968. Now, luckily for them, she had baked some stuff into at least in the documentation, so they recognized what happened and were able to correct it. So, situation worked out okay. To paraphrase my favorite fictional chaos mathematician, failures find a way. So we need to eliminate single points of failure wherever possible. If you aren't sure where they might be, well, here's a thought. Draw the architecture up on the board, point at something shiny and say, hey, what happens if this fails? Now, I've done this in the past. And I can guarantee you one of the answers you're going to get is, well, that can't fail. And I always kind of bite my tongue and say, well, you know what? Just humor me. What would happen if it did fail? We do need to think through how our service could fail. And I know that that's not natural to us. As software engineers, we're really, really good at happy path. Again, somewhat out of character, if I have to admit. We have to think about the road less traveled. Now, one of the ways I try to get people to ponder this is asking them about their morning routine. Take a couple of minutes, jot down your morning routine. And it's always really fascinating because some people are hyper detailed and it's down to almost like by the second. My alarm goes off at 6:31 and I'm in the shower at 6:36 and I'm out of the shower at 6 this, and everything is just down to this timetable. And other people are like, I don't know, I wake up and I make some coffee and then I brush my teeth. And so I always like to kind of poke holes in various parts of this. So let's say you wake up to an alarm. Well, do you set the alarm? Does your partner set the alarm? What happens if power goes out in the middle of the night? What happens? Well, I use my phone. What happens if your phone, loses charge overnight and now it's dead in the morning? We as humans just sort of naturally handle that stuff. Software doesn't. We need to write that into the software. I've had a lot of those debates with customers, and they're all like, oh, we don't need to worry about that. Okay, well, if you're not going to tell me what the system should do, I'll just make it up. I'll make up whatever's easiest for me. So you might want to give me some guidance here. We need to test for these scenarios. Does our service actually respond appropriately when bad things happen? And again, the only real way to know here is unleash some chaos onto your system and see what happens. Now, I have to admit, I think it would be really interesting to have been a fly on the wall when this concept was first introduced at Netflix. I have to imagine it was not met warmly, that there was probably some resistance to the idea. And yet it is ultimately part of why almost any device you have, you tap a button and like high definition TV is streaming to you. I've thought back, if my 20-year-old self could have thought that's the way the world was going to be, it would have blown my mind. I remember thinking it was amazing when I could be in my dorm room in college and like, oh my God, this website has like images on it. Oh my, and they're rendering in like 35 seconds. This is amazing. And like I'm browsing the stacks at Cambridge from my little college in the middle of Minnesota, and now it's like, oh, okay, my high def TV is a little jaggy. My wife and I were watching something last night and getting a little grumpy because how come it's a little pixelated, isn't it? I think it's downcast like 720. Oh my God, like what's going on? Do we need to reboot something? Boy, our expectations change fast, don't they? So we need to break some stuff and see what happens. We need to add some latency and see what happens. We need to shut down an AZ and see what happens. I still think one of the most amazing keynote things I've ever seen. This would have been Spring 1, Austin. Dick's Sporting Goods gets up on stage and they talk about their multi-cloud strategy. And so, as a retailer, they have to be available during the busy retail holiday season. And so they do fail over from one provider to another. And so they actually showed this during the keynote. They shut down one provider, showed all the traffic flowing over to the other provider, and they actively asked the entire audience of several thousand people, please hammer on our website while we're doing this. It's still one of the gutsiest things I've ever seen. And you know, like tip of the hat, amazing engineering, you know, a lot of effort obviously went into that. Now, they have good reasons for that. You know, the business understands this is a business imperative for them. Most of us don't necessarily need that, by the way. So kill an instance, see what happens. Now, again, none of this should be ad hoc. We need to monitor it. We need to log it. And of course, that can go rogue. Now, some things are going to fall through the cracks. So we need to be able to detect those failures. And then when they occur, make sure we add that into our testing suite. And of course, those failures could be internal or external. So always fair to ask, how's your exception handling? You will have bugs. You're a human being. So make sure you're writing good tests. Sometimes these problems are a dependency. So sometimes it's some downstream thing, some third-party thing. Again, how do we recover from that failure? What is the proper response if that service is down? We need to have good resiliency testing. And the way we do that is by forcing our services to fail over and over and over again. We talked a bit about performance testing already, although the interesting thing is where should we run those load tests? Now, for most of my career, I've had something called perf. Maybe you use staging, something like that. And that's not a bad place to start, but it isn't necessarily the same thing your customers are actually going to encounter. And so there is kind of a movement today towards, you know, doing these things in production, you know, monitor-driven development. And that is a little concerning, at least to me. It gives me pause. But then I also remember, well, my customers are testing in prod right now. So I hope they're not running into anything. Now, if you are going to do this, make sure that anything that comes through is a synthetic transaction, or else you end up where Sam talks about in the first edition of his microservices book. Oops, a whole bunch of washing machines showed up at the head office because they were running the tests against the production ordering system and didn't realize that and didn't have synthetic transactions in place. Now, of course, if you're going to do this, make sure everyone knows you're doing it, especially downstream dependencies. Now, for most of my career, performance testing, load testing was this one-off thing we did about 6 weeks before he went to production. And then you took the results, put it in a drawer because nothing we can do about it. We got to go to production. I don't think that's the best idea. I would rather see this run on a regular basis on a cadence of some sort or another. One of the first things I had to deal with as a new architect was, hey, here's this really old VB6 app. They have a performance problem. Fix it. Okay, I've never written a line of VB6 in my life. How am I supposed to handle this? I don't know. You're the architect. Figure it out. All right, so I go to my team. One of the first questions I ask is, when was this performance problem introduced? Sometime in the last 3 years. Okay, cool. So how many hundreds, if not thousands of changes have happened in the last 3 years? Yeah, okay, we're not going to be able to do a root cause analysis kind of thing. So then my next question was, well, do we have a performance region? Can we actually figure out what's going on here? Oh, yeah, no, we don't have perf. Okay, could we get one set up? No. What do you mean no? Well, it turns out the person who knows how to install the application in regions left the company a couple years back and apparently never bothered to write down how to do it. So we don't know how to do it. Cool. I think I may know what some of your problems are here. So if you're going to do this on a regular cadence, just make sure that it's not during some peak traffic hour, at least if you're going to do this in production. What we're striving to do in all of these scenarios is shift things left. Let's find the problem sooner in the process so that it does not impact our customers. If we have a problem, we'll roll back or we'll fail over. And that requires a heavy dose of automation. We cannot afford for this to be right-click in your IDE, drag this here, a human being logs in and does these steps. Human beings get bored. Human beings skip a step. Human beings fat finger a command. Computers don't. Computers are really smart at being stupid. Let them do what they're good at. Again, friends, all services are equal. Some are more equal than others. So what's the impact if this one goes down? Now, we should be able to categorize our incidents and our outages by severity and scope. So what is the impact to the business and how much of the business is impacted? Now, this should be pretty obvious, but we need to have good monitoring. Our observability story has to be solid. There's 4 primary components to monitoring. There's logging, So what would you say your service is doing? Now, in my experience, logs are one of two things. We don't log anything, and then we're like, oh no, there's nothing here. Or we log everything in not just triplicate, but like 10 times over. I love catch, log, throw, catch, log, throw. It's amazing. Checked exceptions were a brilliant idea that no other language should ever copy. So log anything that's useful and helpful, as long as it's not personally identifying information. Do not put PII information in your logs ever. Now, one of the challenges with PII is, well, some things on their own are not, in fact, PII, but as soon as I combine it with one or two other things, oh yeah, I know exactly who you are. I always get concerned when a website or somebody asks me for that kind of information, like zip code or birthday. In many instances, that really is not necessary, and you can just say no, or you can just give them a bogus piece of information. I am amazed at how much they can zero in on you specifically just by knowing basically your zip code. That's generally enough to figure out, who you are. Although their data is not always great. I've gotten a few things to my house where I'm like, you really do have bad data, because this is not something I am remotely interested in. Now, tracing can be a real challenge here again, as you've got calls that are bouncing around between 5, 10, 15 services. You need some way of tying that together. So correlation IDs are really helpful. You're going to have some kind of a dashboard in place to give people a view into your system so they can see how healthy it happens to be. We'll talk more about this in a minute. And we need to have good alerting. Now, alerting is what happens when a key metric is out of band. The goal here is, I see there's a problem, so let me fix it before people even notice. Now, this does imply PagerDuty, and I do want to stress that PagerDuty has to be sustainable. If you are going down this path, make sure you have clear, concise, on-call documentation. Do not assume people know how everything works. Do not assume everyone knows how to clear the cache or SSH into the server or whatever. Write down the steps. At 3 a.m, none of us are thinking straight, or we just got woken up from a deep sleep, or maybe, in a very stressful scenario here, your vision tends to narrow. Write the steps clearly, concisely. We do not rise to our expectations. We fall to the level of our training. It is vital that we think about what we need to monitor. We need to think about what key metrics are for us. Some of that depends on the infrastructure itself. So CPU utilization, RAM utilization, etc. That isn't just going to impact.
I've got a question, Nate.
Oh, yeah, sure.
You want to go back? So you were talking about documentation, which I 100% agree with. I love documentation. But one of the things that I think we fall victim to is that we wrote it down, but we never actually went through and made sure that it was right, or that it stays up to date, right? We wrote it down 4 years ago, but what's changed in those 4 years? So the question is, with everything that you've seen and worked on, how often would you recommend going back and double checking all of that, or even just running through the documentation and seeing if it actually is up to date?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in this, I'd say the same thing about like onboarding guides. We kind of forget about them because I haven't done that in a couple of years. I think the last person who goes through the onboarding guide should be responsible for updating it. And so they should go in and tweak it and fix it. If there's things that need to change, if things have, hey, that URL is actually this, they should be the ones that go in and do it. I'd say the same thing for this kind of a scenario where, hey, the last person that goes in, if something's not right, they should like jot that down and let's get that fixed. Now, I would say that this should be reviewed on a regular basis. Now, I would also say the same thing about your architecture. That's probably annually-ish, maybe a little more often, maybe a little less often. Your own experiences will guide you a little bit here. If you've got a service that, man, this thing's just rock solid, we don't even remember the last time that it went down. Okay, maybe we don't need to focus as much on that one, but if you've got one that's constantly having some growing pains, let's double check. Let's dot our I's and cross our T's. So I would let your own kind of experience guide you a little bit on that frequency, but annually feels like about right for a lot of these things. And certainly you can do it more often if necessary. But if it's been 4 years, I'd absolutely walk back through it and let's just double check that this is actually how we do it. And, that the database backup actually has been working. You hear about those stories every so often where, oh yeah, so we had a database issue and we thought, no big deal, we've got backups, except the backups haven't run in 6 months. Oh, that's a problem. We always forget about disaster recovery until like a disaster happens, and then we all start tearing out our hair going, oops. Bad things are going to happen, just the nature of the beast. You need to, how do I phrase this? You can't rely on like everybody remembering everything all the time. You got to have things just be in the right place. This is another one of those things that I try to do around the house. So a simple example, next to my bed, there's a flashlight, because if the power goes out, I want to just be able to kind of reach down, up, yep, here's my flashlight. There's a flashlight on my kitchen counter next to the radio, so you keep things in the same place so that it's there when I need it. My travel backpack stays packed. I have duplicate of everything in there. I've got a brick for my laptop. I've got all the cables I need. The only thing that ever comes out of there are international plugs and converters. And frankly, sometimes I just leave a universal converter in there all the time, just in case. So to me, that's part of it, right? Is being prepared, making sure that you have tested that out on some cadence, just for, if anything else, just peace of mind. Because bad things are going to happen. I hate to say it, but that's just inevitable in our world. Great question. So we also need metrics that matter to our service, so things like availability, latency, response time, this would pretty much be anything we talked about earlier as an SLO. We need to monitor errors. We need to monitor exceptions. And part of the challenge here is identifying what's normal, what's a warning, and what's this is critical. You need to fix this right now. Your car does some of this for you. So this was a couple months ago, my wife and I were going up to play golf and started out my car, and I looked, I'm like, I've never seen that symbol before. And so of course, my wife, being a diligent business analyst, she gets out the manual, she looks it up, she says, well, that's a low tire pressure warning. I'm like, well, that's weird. And so I looked in the app that it talks to my car, and sure enough, the passenger rear tire was low. Okay, so I drop her off at the golf course and I go to the gas station, put some air in there. And as I'm doing that, I realize, oh, look, there's a screw in here. Well, that's going to be a problem. So now, of course, she, being a good, diligent individual, she had called the dealership and said, hey, we got a problem. They said, no worries, bring it in tomorrow morning. We'll fix it for you. Not exactly the way I planned on spending my Saturday morning, but it all worked out. Now, that was just a warning. If it had been critical, there would have been a different notification that was delivered to me in some way, shape, or form. I remember one point a warning light came out of my car, and I called the dealer, and they said, well, is it blinking? And I said, no. And they said, you're fine. Bring it in, later this week is fine. Oh, okay. This can be hard to figure out a priori. We might need a certain amount of history in order for that to make sense. This isn't just a production thing either. We should be monitoring staging, if for no other reason than a way to validate that our monitors are correct. Now, these metrics should live on a dashboard. There are, nearly infinite ways of doing that. Some are more complicated than others. I was playing around with some stuff in CF back in the day. I did a bunch of stuff with that. There's Envoy dashboards. The moral of the story here is we should be alerted if things start to go out of band, because I don't want someone staring at a dashboard all day. Humans aren't good at that. We're looking for things that stand out. And if everything's kind of the same all the time, we just sort of glaze over and we start ignoring it. So we need an alert that kicks in when something's out of band. Now, absence of a metric, interestingly enough, can also be an alertable offense. And there's a typo. See how that happens? Alerts have certain characteristics that make them alerts. First and foremost, they need to be actionable. There needs to be a sense of urgency, and it needs to be something that a human being has to interject on. If the system can fix itself, we don't need to alert on that. Maybe that goes to like a report or, again, a dashboard of some sort that somebody might look at later. But if the system fixes itself, we're fine. We also need to be very careful that we're not over alerting. I'm sure most of you, when you hear a car alarm, your first reaction is not to run over and see what's happening. It's to, oh my God, please turn off that alarm. Earlier this summer, we went to a concert, and while the parking lot on the way in was fairly organized, on the way out, it was very chaotic. There were no like stanchions that said, you're in the giraffe lot or anything like that. And so at the end of the concert, everyone's just kind of like, oh, geez, I don't know where my car is. And so a lot of people had the brilliant idea of, I'm going to turn on my alert on my car and have it, blare the car alarm. And so cars were doing that left and right. That was really awesome after 2 hours of very loud music. So alerts have to have those characteristics. And if we're not careful, if we over alert, people start ignoring them. That's bad. We need a really good on-call book here. As I mentioned earlier, do not assume everyone knows how to do something. So write the steps, how to mitigate, how to resolve. And this, again, should be step by step by step. I like to follow the 3 a.m. rule, which says that you should assume the person that's reading this is half asleep. Oh, and by the way, they're a psychopath and they know where you live. So let's make sure that they're happy with you when things go on. Do not be clever here. Think simple. Do not assume everyone knows how to do X. Just write it down, spell it out. I mentioned this quote before. We do not rise to the level of our expectations. We fall to the level of our training. I saw this tweet, and frankly, it did kind of give me the shivers. You're a software engineer. There's a production issue. No one knows how it works, but there's a bunch of credentials around the office on Post-it notes, and here's some get diffs. You have an hour, go. One of the first times I used this tweet, someone looked at me and said, oh, that just described my day. That's my job. I'm like, this is not good. It's not good how much this resonated with people. Yes, this does imply some kind of on-call rotation. I am sorry. We all need to take a turn, but it needs to be sustainable. I think in the perfect world, we should pair up. I'd like to see this be 1 week or less per person with about a month off in between. One of my good friends was on call for 3 straight years. Needless to say, that is not in fact sustainable. That's a great way to burn somebody out. Now, documentation. We talked a little bit about this. Let's go a little deeper. What would you say your service does? How does your service work? What are its dependencies? Now, I understand that many of us look at that and say, this documentation is useless. It doesn't actually have to be that way. Neil was lecturing to my grad students, I don't know if it was last fall or the fall before, and he made this comment about, that's a write once, read never artifact. And I piped up and said, boy, that sounds like pretty much everything I've ever created in architecture. And we all kind of had a good laugh about that. But it turns out it doesn't actually have to be that way. We can follow the golden rule. We can do this for the people that come after us. And of course, there's a chance that we will, in fact, be the person that comes after ourselves. There's a pretty good chance at some point in your career, you've looked at some code and you're thinking to yourself, like, what idiot wrote this? And God, I can't believe I have to maintain some moron's code. And then you get a little deeper and realize, I'm the idiot that wrote this. I wasn't as smart as I am now a few years ago, was I? So we have to think about how long it takes for someone to get productive on our team. Is that a couple days? Is that a couple weeks? Is that several months? Do we have good onboarding guides? I'll admit my team didn't have one of these, and we didn't think about it because we never really hired anybody for a long time. And then we hired a bunch of people, and one of them asked, hey, where's your onboarding guide? And we're all looking at each other like, oh, yeah, we should have one of those, shouldn't we? And so we tasked him with building one. See what happens when you ask. Make sure that's updated. Make sure that that is easy to find, which implies a wiki or a website or something similar. Again, updating that should be part of that new developer workflow. I'm a big believer in low ceremony. This shouldn't be overly complicated. We shouldn't add things just to add things. Give me a good, solid description of your service. What does it do? Now, I know you're knee deep in it, and so it all makes sense to you, but give me a couple paragraphs. Give me a couple pages if you need to. I'm an architect, so give me some pictures. Give me the contact information for the team. What's the on-call rotation? Give me links to anything that's useful. Dashboard, on-call book, the FAQ, our development guide, our coding standards, where's the pipeline, the glossary. Glossaries are such powerful artifacts. I wish more teams would invest in those. Whatever helps the team understand. Now, I want everybody to get it. I want them to be able to reflect it back to me. And of course, none of this should be static. This needs to be reviewed on a regular basis. Now, I already kind of hinted at this, but let's talk more about it. These production readiness reviews, these architectural reviews, this is not a one and done, big upfront designy kind of thing. We should be reviewing our services on a regular basis. Again, this does not have to be high ceremony. I've been on the receiving end of a bunch of things that have like review board in their name. They're all miserable. And I've never found that to be useful. If for no other reason, then those folks don't have enough context to actually tell me whether my application is correct or not. I suspect the only real value they have is you won't put in the effort and energy to produce all the artifacts they demand of you unless you're serious. And so it's sort of a sieve from that perspective. So get the right people together, your architects, your SREs, your devs, whomever you need. Draw the architecture up on the proverbial whiteboard. Does everybody understand what the system does? Probably not. Do we all understand the requirements? Probably not. As you walk through it, you're going to find some bottlenecks. You're going to discover that, oh, geez, the Wombat service actually has a lower availability level than what we're shooting for. You're going to find some interesting failure cases that almost always correlate with time. Like, oh, no, and month end corresponds with a super blue blood moon eclipse. We've got problems. Years ago, I worked on this application and we built it for another part of the company to use. And so a couple months after we handed it over, my director came to me one morning and said, hey, you worked on that thing for the code people, right? And I said, uh-huh. He's like, I had a build break this morning. Can you help them? Well, I'm like, of course, but they should just look at their last commit. That's probably the issue. He said, yeah, they said they haven't changed the code in a couple of days, so they're not sure why the build broke. All right. So I looked at their Jenkins instance and saw they had a failing test, and I dug into it and I looked at it and I started laughing and I realized, oh yeah, this test is going to fail every 7 years. Now I wrote it, so it's my fault. I honestly don't know how I fixed it. My suspicion is I put a comment in there that just said, this is going to fail every 7 years. Sorry. That's my guess. I don't remember, to be honest with you. It was a while back. Reviews should result in some new pictures, probably going to have some new things on your backlog that you then have to prioritize along with everything else. So do an audit. Go up back to your checklist. Does this service still meet our needs? Again, this is going to result in some new items on your backlog, and now you can start thinking about where does this need to be fixed? How do we prioritize that along with everything else? Because we don't get to do everything at the same time. Now, I understand a lot of this is manual. We can actually automate some of it, though. I'm a huge fan of evolutionary architecture, and one of the most powerful concepts that came out of this, really for me anyway, was fitness functions. Best way to describe this is a to-do list for developers from architects. It's also lightweight, low ceremony governance. In a nutshell, it is a set of tests that we execute on a regular basis to validate our architecture continues to meet our needs. Now, this comes out of evolutionary algorithms, which says, hey, as we change things, does this change actually get us closer to or further from our objectives? And so the idea here is let's just apply this to architecture. It's quite brilliant in its simplicity. Now, obviously, we want most of this automated. Some, sadly, still have to be manual, but we might decide we don't want any cyclical dependencies. Maybe you've got a new team and you want to get your directionality of imports right. So it's totally fine for you to include util into persistence or web. But if we go the other way, that's a problem. Let's break the build. We want to make sure that we're not breaking some downstream consumers. So maybe we use consumer-driven contracts as a way of validating that. Big fan of that. Maybe we use a tool like ArcUnit, or if we're in the C# universe, that's fine too. There's tools like Scientist out there as well. Maybe we look at average response time, maximum response time, what happens to response time as number of users goes up, as number of requests goes up. Maybe we want to look at the number of timeouts, application faults. My grad students a few years ago said they're really interested in when they tick over to the next price tier with their cloud provider. Maybe when a new instance dies, we want to make sure another one spins up. Again, we want to alert when things go out of band, and so that people know what's going on and can react accordingly. Again, some things are going to fall through the cracks. This is where chaos engineering becomes so powerful. By the way, that Venn diagram of fitness functions does include chaos engineering to a certain degree. I don't mean for any of this to be additional red tape, overly bureaucratic. It should not be heavyweight, high ceremony. We're talking about a couple hours at most. All right, so a few next steps I'll leave you with here tonight. Check your culture. This is hard. Culture is where good ideas go to die. Maybe think about a checklist. You do some of these production readiness reviews, but the most important part of this is we need to adapt and we need to change. That's the whole point of this, is learning from the things that went well and the things that could have gone better. I wish you luck. Questions, comments, theories, queries?
Awesome. Yeah, we do have a few questions, so we'll just
Excellent.
start running down the list. All right.
Awesome.
What are the top things companies tend to neglect with SRE?
Ooh, oh, that's a great question. One of the places that we tend to get in trouble on SRE is not giving our engineers enough time to actually do SRE work. You've got to be able to automate away the toil. You've got to be able to do the automation and build those tools. As developers, we tend to be like the cobbler's children. We write code all day, but then we don't write any for ourselves. So if our SREs are just constantly focused on outages and alerts and all this, they can't fix the things that are going badly. There is a pretty good advice that basically says you may have to at some point kind of lower your SLA or your SLO a bit to give yourself some breathing room so that you can improve things, so that you can crank things up. Another related thing is sometimes we exceed our expectations, and that tends to add badly because then projects start relying on us exceeding the expectations. This happened at Google. I don't remember which service it was. It was an internal thing. And they just expected developers that, oh, it always exceeds, so we can rely on it exceeding. And then it actually hit its number for its SLO, and apps started going down left and right. People are like, oh my God, what's going on? You guys always exceed. And so they literally started baking in some latency and whatnot to bring their numbers down so that people wouldn't basically depend on them exceeding their numbers. That's a little extreme. Hopefully that doesn't happen to you. But to me, those are those kinds of things, right? Okay, I'm back. Good deal. That was fun. Make sure people have time to get away from the toil, to automate away the toil, and then make sure that we don't, that if we are exceeding our numbers, we then have a conversation about what does that mean for us? Do we need to change our SLAs, or do we need to make sure people aren't relying on us exceeding that? Great question.
Awesome. Very good. All right, let's see. We had one that was upvoted. Here we go. I really liked how you were talking about culture playing a major part in success. What are some things that line developers and architects can do to push culture improvements?
Ooh, be the culture change you want. And the other part is, and this is really hard for me, is it requires patience. This doesn't change overnight. And it's understanding that you're going to have to kind of reinforce these things. You're going to have to give people pats on the back when they do it right. You also have to understand the journey that everybody's on. We always have to remember that, like, if you're already using a certain tool, you've already gone through that initial sort of hurdle, right? So I think about my experience with Git. First time I ever saw anything on Git, there was a tech talk at Google, and I watched it some rainy Saturday. A buddy of mine's like, oh my God, this is amazing. You got to watch this. And so I watched it. And frankly, I was insulted because Linus basically spent an hour saying, if you aren't using my shell scripts, you are an idiot. Only an idiot would use Subversion. And I'm like, I like Subversion. I'm good at Subversion. Why am I an idiot? I want to use your shell scripts. And so I just kind of ignored Git. And then a friend of mine did a presentation on it, and I sat in and watched it. And I'm like, oh, that's pretty powerful. That's got some cool features and that Subversion doesn't have. And then I saw another friend of mine do a presentation on it, and he showed a couple more things. And I'm like, this is really cool. And I started playing around with it. And eventually I'm like, this is awesome. I can't imagine using anything else. Linus was right. I mean, I didn't like the way he said it, but yeah, it's a good tool. So I have to remember that when I encounter somebody who's new to this, they're where I used to be. And I have to have some empathy. I have to approach them with some grace that, okay, you're going to come along on this journey. I'll never forget being at our company picnic one time. And I was sitting next to a friend of mine. And I said, hey, Al, how's it going? And she just looked at me and she said, yeah, I don't know, Nate. I'm on one of these agile projects. Now, my first kind of gut reaction was, kind of roll my eyes and be like, okay, waterfaller. And then I had to take a step back and I had to think to myself, you know what? Althea's been delivering code to production for years. She's a senior engineer. She's been doing this longer than I have. And so if someone like me comes along and looks at her and says, oh, Al, the way you've been doing it your whole career, oh, you're wrong. Well, how would I expect her to react to that? So if I'm bringing in a new idea, I have to expect some resistance. I have to work with people on this. I have to have some day in the life conversations. So when I brought cloud into my previous company, a lot of pushback. Oh my God, there's all these new technologies. Oh my God, you're changing my life. People don't like change. We're not big fans of change. So I had to have a lot of conversations and be willing to have that discussion and say, okay, this is how your life's going to change. You're going to actually have better tools now. And that thing you hate doing goes away. The system takes care of that for you. But you have to have that patience. You have to have that conversation. We're going to say, yep, okay, this is what we're going to do. And it's okay. I will meet you where you're at, and I will help you make this journey. So that's the way I've tried to approach it. And it isn't easy. And I'm not a patient human being. I want the change to happen like right now. And so a lot of it is me going, okay, just it'll happen. Just keep reinforcing. It'll happen. I mean, I run into that with my teenager, like, hey, pick up after yourself. Certain things I've said a lot.
Very true. Very true. All right, let's see. Next one's uploaded. What smells indicate to you that a tool or framework isn't going to endure long term?
Ooh, sometimes it's easier to figure out which ones won't. So there's certain things I expect a tool to be able to do for me, and I'll relay a story that kind of walks you through my thinking on this. Years ago, my organization, somebody thought it was a good idea to bring in this WYSIWYG drag and drop kind of technology, and I was pretty resistant, to be honest with you. But one of my colleagues thought this thing was amazing, and so we're having a conversation one day, and I said, "Okay, so my friend, tell me, how do you do a diff on this? Because this is all WYSIWYG. So how do you know what I changed? How do I know what you changed?" And he's like, "Oh, that's a good question. Well, I could do a screen print, and then just side by side visual compare." Well, that's not great. So I said, "Okay, well, riddle me this. How do you write an automated unit test for this thing?" He said, "Oh, Nate, that's the best part. Because of all the guardrails, you don't have to." I went, "Okay, well, that's a problem." So to me, that's part of it, right? Is recognizing these core principles that I expect a tool to be able to do. And if it can't do that, that's a problem. I also think we need to be cautious to just because something is old, and we define old seemingly as anything that's been around since like Monday in this industry. That's not a good reason to kick something to the curb. But you've got to find that interesting sort of combination of there's a good community there, solves a real problem, solves that problem in an elegant way, a way we haven't been able to solve before, builds on what's come before. So it's often easier to figure out where, hey, this is like that thing we used to do, and you still haven't solved this problem. So yes, it's like this thing we used in the past, but it has figured out how to get around X or Y.
Very good. Thanks. Let's see. Where do I want to go next?
These are great questions.
On the journey to CI and CD, what are some tips for maintaining quality?
Ooh, so there are good tools we can add in that will help us with that. So there's an awful lot we can do automated against our code that will look for certain smells. You've got to take all of those with a grain of salt because it is a static analysis. Some of those rules are contradictory. You do need to have some discussions on which rule sets do we actually want to apply. I'm a big fan of that because that keeps us hopefully in a good place. If we start with that from the beginning, there's a pretty good chance our code's not going to get too out of hand. If I've got an existing code base and I bring one of those in, I have to be a little cautious that I don't turn on too many rules right away because I'm going to have a lot of warnings, a lot of errors. So I think bringing those kind of tools to bear is really important. It's also recognizing when things are starting to get out of band a bit. We all kind of have that feel when we're looking at our code of this isn't quite up to our standards, or maybe we rush this in. And then it's having that willingness to go in and refactor and actually make the code better than we found it. A lot of times that's, again, a cultural issue more than anything else. I had a young developer come to me once and he's like, I'm trying to do it right. I get a bug, and so I write tests to show me the bug exists. And when I'm in the code, I'm making it better, and I'm writing tests, and I'm refactoring. And so, it takes me a couple days to fix a bug. And And my last one-on-one, my manager was like, hey, how come it takes you so long to fix everything? If I give that bug to so-and-so, he gets it done in a couple hours. I give it to you and it takes a couple days. Like, you need to be more like him. And of course he's looking at going, yeah, but that dude starts as many fires as he puts out. He's the arsonist firefighter here. He's not doing it well. He's leaving the code worse than when he found it. And I felt very bad for this young developers. I'm like, yeah, gosh, I don't know what to tell you here. Now, he ended up leaving the company because he was so frustrated by this scenario, and I tried to tell him, hey, you're doing the right stuff. If you're working for me, I'd be giving you a raise and a promotion for that. So how do you teach that manager that actually this person who takes longer is doing it right? And it's, take the time it takes, so it takes less time. Again, that's that cultural issue we get back to of, hey, we need to understand the value in having clean code and that it isn't just a nice to have kind of thing. These are awesome. You guys are great.
Let's see. All right. What is your top advice on the journey from monolith to microservices?
Don't rush it. Modular monoliths are not a bad thing. Take the time it takes to get there. If we're not careful, we create a distributed big ball of mud, and that's worse than a big ball of mud. So figure out where those seams are, break it apart into the modular monolith. That will help you see where those bounded contexts are. Makes it a lot easier then to evolve into microservices. And you'll also understand where you get the bang for the buck. And you realize, actually, this is okay if this is more monolithy, and we're going to get some serious lift if we make these 2 or 3 or 4 chunks their own microservices. That gives us some of that, the wins we get from a microservice architecture. It doesn't have to be the whole thing. And so that's where we start getting into, and that's the responsible microservice stuff I talked about at the very, very beginning. Why should something be a microservice? Not everything needs to be or deserves to be. So we need to get a trade-off for that. There has to be, there's no free lunches here. So if I'm going to add some complexity by bringing that in as a distributed architecture, let's make sure I have a good reason for doing that, not just, again, because I heard microservices were cool.
That makes sense. And that leads into the next one that I've got. How well do you think the industry, kind of as a whole, is doing with microservices?
It varies. Obviously, some folks are at, I guess you'd say, kind of a higher level of maturity, and they've got the muscle memory there. They've got the pipelines, the techniques, the experience. It gets easier over time. It's like anything. If you only do something once or twice, you're not going to be very good at it. If you do it lots and lots and lots, you're going to get better at it. So at first, we all kind of stumble and we have a lot of issues. You got to persevere if this is the right direction for your application. So some places are doing it very well, some not so much. Sometimes we get too caught up in like the platonic ideal definition of these things. It's okay to have a couple of your microservices talk to the same data store, provided you control both of those microservices. The reason, microservices each have their own data store concept came about was, well, it's really hard to integrate at the database level. And we've all had that experience where we didn't realize somebody was calling our tables directly, like, please don't do that. And so, well, you know what, if each service has its own data store, then I can change that at my heart's content and I'm not affecting you. But shoot, now I've got the same data in like 3 or 4 different data stores. How do I replicate it? How do I get it across? How out of date is it? Well, you know what? It might be easier just to have 2 or 3 services talk to the same data store. Now, some people would say that's not microservices, that's service-based. Okay. Who wants to argue about the definition of made-up words with me? You've got to do what's right. You have experience. You have a background. You know your application. You know the constraints and demands on it. If the right answer is to have 2 services talk to the same data store, then do that. Don't be confined or bound by some definition somebody tweeted out or something you found on the interwebs. You have to use your own expertise as well.
Very good. I like that one. That's good. And this next one you can kind of take however you'd like. I mean, we've been talking about software, but this is kind of the AMA part of it, right? So, however you would you'd like to take it. So, what are you excited about these days?
Oh boy, that's a great question. Man. One of the things that I really dig is code katas, interestingly enough. So I do this with my grad students. I make my grad students go through, we do it from an architectural perspective more than anything else, but it's interesting to see how some places are now applying that to interviews. I'm not a big fan of the way we interview people, especially sort of the FANG companies of, here's a coding thing. I need you to whiteboard bubble sort, go memorize a bunch of algorithms you may have learned in computer science. I just don't think that's practical to day in, day out engineering. But what is interesting is, how do you think about a problem? So here, let me give you a little paragraph of requirements that are very vague and unsatisfying. What questions are you going to ask? What direction are you going to take this? How do you think about this problem is really, really interesting to me. I guess one of the other things that I'm pretty excited about is season 3 of Ted Lasso eventually coming out. I'm a huge fan of Ted Lasso. I can't wait for the next season. I'm really on that edge of, I want like infinity seasons of that show because I think it's so amazing, but I'd also rather have it end too early and just live in my mind as this perfect thing that it has been for the last 2 years than have 2 or 3 mediocre seasons. I'd rather not have the last season of Game of Thrones happen to Ted Lasso. Let me put it that way. I'd rather just end on season 3 or 4. Oh my God, it was amazing. I'll just keep rewatching it till I'm old. But God, I hope we get a lot more of it. So, from a technology perspective, I don't get to be dogmatic in my job. I have to be a pragmatist. And one of the big shifts when you become an architect is it's not in my best interest to be an evangelist for a specific technology. I have to let my teams drive that more, and also realize that there's a lot of different solutions. What hills do I want to die on? What battles do I want to fight? And so you kind of have to leave a little bit of that behind of, advocating for X or Y and seeing where that gets us. I'm really interested to see what happens with our next version of Spring here. I think there's going to be some pretty cool stuff hiding in that. I'm very curious to see, sort of, are we going to keep getting better at all this distributed architecture stuff, or are we going to get some new abstractions built on top of that? At what point are we going to stop talking about Kubernetes? When does that just become dial tone, which is really where it should be, in my opinion. No customer has ever come to you and said, I need more Kubernetes. I get why we like it. It's a really super cool technology. But at the end of the day, I want my developers writing apps and focused on features and functionality. And if Kubernetes is what's managing that, fantastic. But anything we can do to get that to the point where it fades into the background, I think is going to be a huge win for us.
Excellent. Very good. All right. So this is the last one that we've got in the list of questions. People, if you've got more questions, feel free to ask some. I may have some along the way, or we can just end a little bit early. So pulling out your crystal ball here, how do you think software development will change over the next 5 years?
I'm always reminded of, and I'm paraphrasing, I know Gates made some comment about we overestimate where things are going to be in 2 years and underestimate where they're going to be in 10 years. I suspect, again, Kubernetes is going to be there. It's just, we're not going to deal with it directly. At least not. And I frankly don't think developers should be working at kubectl on a day in, day out basis. So it's just going to get easier. Let me rephrase. It's going to get simpler. We'll have bigger abstractions to work with, and we'll get better at gluing those things together. I don't know that we're going to necessarily have a new data store. I think maybe that's kind of quieted down to the point where these are kind of the primary ones. We're going to get better at writing these resilient services, at doing this reliably, repeatably. That I think is really where we're going. Now, does that mean there's going to be a new language, a new framework? I mean, maybe. I don't know. Those things kind of come and go. I'm not as excited about that as I was when I was first playing around with code, to be honest with you. So I think we'll just get better at it, and I hope we'll start to learn more where to use which tool. We tend to get so fixated on everything's got to be a microservice. Everything's got to be a function. Everything's got to be AI. Everything's got to be ML. Okay, use it where it makes sense, and know that it's okay sometimes to use the older tool if it gets the job done. And so I'm also hopeful that we'll be less quick to throw things away. So there's sort of this theory that if something's old, it by definition is, oh, did you lose me? There we go. It must be arcane and complex, and the new is always simple and elegant, except the new is usually unfinished and unproven and untested, and the old is stable and refined. So maybe we shouldn't be so quick to just kick something to the curb just because it is 6 months old. So I'm hopeful that we'll get some more maturity there. But this is an interesting job, right? Because we're constantly being asked to build solutions to problems no one's ever built a solution for before, using tools that we just invented. And then people are stunned that we can't give them an accurate date for how long it's going to take. I don't know. I'm building the tools as we go. Pretty confident when we were first building houses and buildings and roads, we weren't real accurate on our estimates there either. But give us a couple thousand years and we'll probably be able to hone in real good on that. So, I won't be around, but future generations. Of course, by then it'll just be computer do this, or AI will have taken over the world. And I, for one, welcome our new robotic overlords.
Very good. So I don't see any others that have come in. So I'm going to ask one that I've got. And this one, you can take this one however you will. But over the last couple of years, right? What's been the most exciting thing that's happened to you during the pandemic?
I learned how to bake bread, and that morphed into pizza. And so for my birthday this year, my in-laws and my wife got me a pizza oven. So we've been doing it on a baking steel in our oven, which makes good pizza. My oven only gets to
stone oven.
So I've actually my new one's an uni, I guess how you pronounce it, and so that one will take either. Right now I've got it hooked up to propane, but you can use wood or charcoal or combination. But that thing gets really hot, so that thing gets up around 850 degrees. My oven in the house here, 500, she tops out. So it's really fascinating to see how different a pizza is that one took 7 minutes. This one took 3 minutes. It definitely makes a difference. So I've enjoyed that quite a bit. I'll also say the pandemic, having us all at home, doing these things virtually, has given us a lot of time back, and being able to invest that in other places is pretty powerful. I was scheduled to fly to Utah, like in, I think it was April of that month, if I remember right. And then the pandemic happened, and that didn't happen.
Yeah, we canceled on that one, thinking it was, it'll just blow over in a little bit. We'll be back to normal.
Right. We'll just reschedule it for later in the summer.
Yep.
That time has been something that I've certainly tried to leverage. Last year I rode my bike a lot. I played a lot of golf. The year before I played a lot of golf. I got to spend a lot more time with my family than I would in a normal time. But it also gave us insights into our coworkers and our friends that we never had before. And I think it was really refreshing to see our colleagues in something other than these artificial felt line boxes that we've been living in for my entire career. I thought it was great that you got to see people's pets and their kids and their spouse and get a view into their lives. And I think it's been a really powerful forcing function to let all of us start to reevaluate, hey, what is important to me? Where do I want to spend my time? Is this where I want to live? I know so many people who have moved, and in some cases they've like left the country entirely and gone somewhere else. But that's really powerful. And I, for one, get really irritated when I see some of these companies like, oh, it's time to come back to work. Really? Everybody I know is working pretty freaking hard for the last 2.5 years, to the point of burning out in many instances. And I know my wife works for the state of Minnesota as a business analyst, and there's some hints that, well, if Republicans take over the legislature in the fall, well, they may decide everybody has to come back in the office. And I'm just thinking, like, how ridiculous is that? And that's not even going to work, because several of her colleagues have moved outstate to where commuting into the city ain't going to work. And it just seems so ridiculous. Why do you subject someone to a commute so they can be in a felt line box and get on a call like this with other people in other felt line boxes. I just don't understand that. So my hope is that coming out of that, we embrace these new styles of working, and whatever the new normal is going to look like is going to be different than the old normal. And I think that's ultimately a win for us. That's not to say we'll never be in an office ever, but I don't think it needs to be Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, the way it was, for 20 years of my life.
Right. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that one. So that's all the questions I've got.
Awesome.
Unless I'm going to turn this one around. Do you have any questions for me you would like me to answer?
Oh man, that's a good question. How are you guys finding the virtual presentations? I know we certainly saw at the beginning of the pandemic, huge embrace of that. Definitely has kind of been a bit of a downturn, but we've also noticed with in-person events, by and large, most of the in-person events this year, anywhere from 40 to 60% of their normal people. I can think of only a couple events that got near their sort of pre-pandemic numbers. And when we've kind of been scratching our heads a little bit about that, like, are people just not quite ready? Are people just, they're out of the habit? I don't know. I'm very curious to see, do you have any thoughts on what kind of the future of in-person user groups at all looks like? I caught a little bit of your, we tried one and nobody came, basically.
Right. Yeah. So we, your off the cuff numbers pretty well match what we've seen here in UJUG, and also I think you were at DevNexus, weren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are pretty much about the same numbers that the JUG leaders the day before the conference started.
Sure.
We're saying it's all about the same. As far as why, all we've got are speculations, right? We were seeing a bunch of people at the beginning. We've now kind of petered out. We've got 30 people, or we had 30 people that were here tonight. We were averaging 100, 110 in person before the pandemic. One of the things we've thought about is because it was like basically right after the working day previously, it was easy for people to leave and just say, hey, I've got an extra couple of hours that, I'll be back a couple hours later, and just go to the event instead of going home and doing all of that.
Sure.
We do have Brian over here says, I love the option for virtual, but miss the networking and the in-person meetings. Yeah, that's kind of what it really boils down to for us as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating because even at the U, we went virtual, and it was spring break during the pandemic. That's when we went virtual, and there was the expectation that we would be back in person in fall of 21. My cohort, we were in person the very first day, and as a group, they're like, no, we want to be virtual. Now, interestingly enough, the cohort behind them had the opposite opinion. They said, absolutely not, we want to be in person. So it's interesting to see, I don't know what to make of that. That's the only two data points. I liked it being virtual because I don't have to drive down to Minneapolis, find parking, and inevitably, the worse the weather, the further away the parking option would be for me. The closest ramp would be full if the weather was bad, and it gave me back at least an hour on every time I had to teach, and that's kind of nice, So it was pretty slick to just do it at home, and my home setup's pretty nice. The room that I usually have at the U is not my favorite. So it was a little painful to deal with that, but we go where people want us to be, I guess. I will say DevNexus was my first in-person event since the pandemic. And I did one event, I guess, in December, but it was so good to be back in front of people again and to be with my friends, to be with my colleagues. I missed that so much. And as much as I do, I appreciate how much time it takes now. I didn't really think about that in the past, but like I did an event in Italy and Jakob and I were comparing notes, and it took us about 20 hours to get from where we were to where we needed to be, because it was, you fly into this airport and then you have to take a train and then you have to walk. And, so it was good 20, a 20-hour trip. And then you start to think, well, is that worth it? And you go, well, I mean, we had a good crowd. We got a lot of good questions. It was nice to interact with people. So I don't know. I'm still curious to see what this all looks like, as we progress.
Yeah, no, I had pretty much the same reaction with DevNexus that you had. People asked me what it was, and as an attendee, I'm not really sure. I didn't really speak to a whole lot of the attendees and ask them what they thought about it, how they felt.
Sure.
Overall, the energy seemed to be there, and it was pretty much about the same as what it was pre-pandemic. Yeah. But as a speaker, it was a totally different experience. It was like a reunion,
100%.
right? Like
it's night and day.
You in 2 years. What's going on? Let's catch up.
I know.
Amazing.
Well, my whole team is distributed, and you got in this rhythm of, well, yeah, no, I'll see you in a couple of weeks at this event, and then it's been 2.5 years, and we finally got the whole team together in June in New York, and so that was the first time I'd met some of my colleagues in person, and so the running joke was, oh my God, you do have legs, because I'd never seen you below the waist before, right? And so that was. Being with my teammates was so powerful. And I will say, as a presenter, I'd much rather present to a live audience, because I can see the reactions. I can see whether did that joke land? Is this working? Are you getting it? Do I need to repeat that? It's a lot more draining to present to a screen, because I have to bring all the energy instead of getting it reflected from the crowd. And so it is more challenging. I definitely missed that for sure. And so it's trade-offs, like everything in software. I mean, I appreciate the fact that I can do this event with you, and it's a couple hours as opposed to a day and a half. It's an easy flight for me. Minneapolis to Salt Lake's not a big deal, but it's a night. It's fly down in the morning or in the afternoon, fly home the next morning. So I mean, you're going to burn some clock. It's kind of nice that, oh yeah, my wife and I did a bike ride before dinner, which I wouldn't have been able to do if I was in person. So it's trade-offs. It's like everything.
Yep. No, 100%. Oh, we do have a question that popped up. Let's see. What does this one say? Oh, Matt, that is a very good question. And I don't know if Nate will be able to answer that one. His question is No Fluff coming back to Salt Lake?
Oh,
that's a Jay question.
Boy,
I don't know.
That's a great question. Yeah, Jay's the right person to answer that one. I mean, I know he has cut down considerably this year on dates. I know cities that traditionally had 2 shows have 1. Minneapolis always had a fall and a spring. Boston had a fall and a spring. Reston had a fall and a spring, and some of those core shows have disappeared. I have to imagine eventually, he'll add that back into the agenda. I know for him, it's just, when are the numbers going to come back? And I know he's kind of trying like the hybrid, which I find kind of hard as a presenter, because I'm dealing with the people in the room and I'm trying to deal with people on a Zoom call, and that's a lot to juggle. So I think once his numbers get back to where he's used to, then I have no doubt that he'll go to as many cities as he wants. I mean, I know that was a long time stop for us, and that was the birth of the 2-day show. Gosh, I can't even remember how many times I've done that event.
It's been a long time. Yeah, no.
It has. Yeah. But it's a fun city.
Thanks for the question.
I love Salt Lake.
It's
an easy flight. It's hub to hub for me.
Right. Those are definitely the easy flights for sure.
Oh yeah, totally.
So let's see. We're up at the top of the hour, so I think we'll call it.
Oh yeah. Sounds good.
Let's see. So I'll raffle off a couple of things that we've got right here. So Angelo Contegas, are you still here? Hopefully. Must be present to win. And maybe I can just go down here and look at people and see who's still here. He is not still here. All right. Let's see. Brian, are you here? Brian Dowdy, you are. Brian, can you use an Agile Learner subscription? Sweet. Well, that one's yours then. Oh, IntelliJ over here. Let's see who we got next. Nope, they're gone. Oops. I can type. Jay Askren, you're still here. Could you use an IntelliJ license? Cool. That one is yours. And I think I need to find one more. Matt Wright, are you here? Matt is here. Matt, could you use an IntelliJ license? Or, for that matter, any of JetBrains IDEs? Almost feel like the price is right? Come on down.
I'll never forget doing the Twin Cities JUG. Oh gosh, this was at least a decade ago, and we were raffling off books. And so first 4 or 5 books, whatever they were, no problem. And then we get to whatever the last book was, and the person's like, no, and then pull another hat, no, and pull another hat, no, and everyone's like, does anybody want it? And like, no. And I don't remember what the book was, don't remember the title. I felt so bad. I'm like, thank God the author's not here. I mean, imagine how embarrassing that would be. And I'm sure it was a great book, but it just, people were just not interested in that topic. And
yep. All right, let's see. Justin Ellis, looks like you're here. Would you use an IntelliJ or a JetBrains license? All right, cool. So we got that done.
Woot woot.
We successfully completed the raffle. But
system works.
Yeah. That reminded me the raffle that happened this year at DevNexus. fun.
Yeah, I apparently won something and didn't realize there was a raffle, so that's on me. Yep. Ken decided to rub that into me later. He's like, hey, you won an iPad, but you weren't there. I'm like, oh, really? So
that's one of the best parts, right? When one of the friends wins it and they know how it works. They're like, man, well.
Yeah, oops.
Awesome.
Oh well. What are you gonna do?
Let's see. We have the fortune that we've got Steve here. Steve, if you don't mind, I'm going to bring you up, and you can tout your meeting for next month. So talking about the new stuff in Java from 11 to what's the current one? 17? Yeah, we're at 17. So I'll invite Steve up. Steve, you can always decline and whatnot, but I'll send that out. And you can talk about that real quick, and we'll go from there. After Steve's done, we'll call it a night. Thanks, everyone, for showing up, and appreciate it. Nate, again, thanks for being able to do this for us, and we appreciate it.
You bet. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. And we'll see if Steve actually has the same problem that you did. It says accepted and connecting. We'll see if it's the problem or not.
It only took me a reboot and what else do I have to do? A reconnect. I actually was almost starting to do it on my phone. During the pandemic, I had that happen to me. I was doing a presentation for a client, and it was really late at night. It was for one of their Asian groups or something, and it was probably like 2 a.m, and I realized my internet just went down. And I think that was when my internet provider was doing some maintenance, and I literally finished the talk on my phone. It was good times. It's good times.
All good. All right. Well, I'm not seeing Steve, so we'll just assume that it's good. Yep, not allowing him to connect. All right. Well, thanks everyone for showing up. Appreciate it. Nate, you have a nice night.
Thanks everybody. Appreciate your time. Cheers.
All right. Take care, everyone.